Imagine a cold, rainy morning in March 1970 at New York's JFK International Airport. In the distance, a massive silhouette cuts through the gray horizon, a giant with a distinctive upper deck hump and four roaring engines. It is the Boeing 747, the queen of the skies, and on its tail is a single glowing blue globe. To the world watching that day, the Pan American World Airways logo wasn't just a corporate brand, it was the unofficial flag of the United States. It was the face of a superpower that had conquered the globe and was looking toward the stars. For decades, Pan Am was the most experienced airline in the world, a sanctuary for the elite where the champagne never stopped flowing and the stewardesses were symbols of a perfect, unreachable American standard. But underneath the veneer of Irish linen and seven-course meals, the foundations of this global empire were already beginning to crack. The story of Pan Am is not merely a chronicle of aviation, it is an epic tragedy of corporate hubris, geopolitical intrigue, and the cold reality of a changing world. It is the definitive investigation into the rise and fall of the Blue Globe Empire. A journey from the high-stakes boardrooms of Manhattan and the secret uranium roots of World War II to the final, tear-soaked landing in Miami. The DNA of Pan Am began with the ruthless ambition of Juan Trippe. Born in 1919, Trippe was a man who saw the world as a strategic map to be conquered. Educated at Yale University, he was a member of the secretive Skull and Bones Society, a connection that would prove more valuable than any fleet of aircraft. At Yale, Trippe learned the language of the American elite, building a network of bonesmen that reached into the highest levels of the U.S. State Department and the War Department. In 1927, while the aviation industry was still in its infancy, Trippe looked at the 90 miles of ocean separating Key West from Havana and saw his opening. He didn't just want to fly mail, he wanted to control the gateway to the Americas. In a move that defined his career, Trippe secretly bought out his two competitors and presented a unified bid to the U.S. Post Office, securing the first-ever international airmail contract. This was the birth of the chosen instrument philosophy, the idea that the United States should have only one flagship carrier abroad, protected and subsidized by the government to compete with the state-backed airlines of Europe. Under Trippe's relentless drive, Pan Am didn't just expand, it colonized the skies. By 1930, it was the largest airline on Earth, and its board of directors commanded a combined wealth of nearly $850 million, a staggering sum for the era. As the decade progressed, Trippe realized that the future of international travel lay crossing the vast Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. However, land runways long enough to support heavy, fuel-laden planes were almost non-existent outside of major Western hubs. Trippe's solution was the flying boat, a fleet of aircraft he poetically named clippers after the swift sailing ships of the 19th century. The apex of this era was the Boeing 314. This was a titan of engineering, weighing 40 tons with a wingspan that rivaled a modern jumbo jet. Within its hull, the 314 was a floating palace. First class was the only class. Passengers dressed in suits and gowns for dinner, served on Lenox china and crystal glassware with specialized suction bottoms to prevent spills during turbulence. The planes featured private dressing rooms, a dining salon that could be converted into a lounge, and a deluxe compartment in the tail that functioned as a bridal suite. This was air travel as a social event, but it was also a logistical nightmare. To make the San Francisco to Manila route viable, Trippe had to build his own world, chartering freighters to transport construction crews and tons of supplies to desolate Pacific atolls like Midway, Wake, and Guam. He built luxury hotels on these desert islands so his elite passengers could rest during the refueling stops of a journey that lasted days. Technically, the B-314 was so advanced it featured crawlways inside the wings, allowing flight engineers to service and repair engines in midair, a feat of bravery performed over 400 times between 1939 and 1941 alone. When the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Silver Clippers were suddenly painted in olive drab camouflage. Pan Am was no longer a commercial airline. It had become a paramilitary wing of the U.S. military. Because Trippe possessed the world's only transoceanic transport system, his entire infrastructure was requisitioned for the war effort. His pilots reported German U-boat patrols patterns to military intelligence, and his training facilities in Miami processed thousands of navigators and air crews, including members of Jimmy Doolittle's legendary Raiders. But the most sensitive mission in Pan Am's history was hidden from the public for decades. It was the transport of uranium for the Manhattan Project. The richest uranium ore on Earth was found in the Belgian Congo, and with Nazi U-boats prowling the Atlantic, the only way to get it to the United States was by air. Pan Am clippers shuttled tons of African uranium ore in total secrecy, flying at extreme altitudes to avoid detection. Historians now estimate that 75% of the uranium used in the Little Boy bomb dropped on Hiroshima was moved in secret by Pan Am. Simultaneously, Trippe's crews provided the transportation for President Franklin Roosevelt's historic flight to the Casablanca Conference in 1943. Boarding the Dixie Clipper in Miami, FDR became the first sitting president to fly while in office, and the first to visit a war zone since Abraham Lincoln. For those few years, Pan Am was more than an airline. It was a critical instrument of American national survival. The end of the war brought a transition from the water to concrete runways, and Trippe once again proved he was a man who lived in the future. In the mid-1950s, the aviation industry was skeptical of jet engines, seeing them as fuel-guzzling and unreliable. Trippe disagreed. In 1955, he placed a massive order for Boeing 707s and Douglas DC-8s, single-handedly launching the jet age. On October 26, 1958, Pan Am inaugurated the first commercial jet service from New York to Paris, cutting travel time nearly in half. It was during this era that the Pan Am girl became a global icon. The airline's stewardesses were ambassadors of American prestige, selected through a process more rigorous than an Ivy League admission. Only 2 out of every 800 applicants were hired. They were required to be college graduates, fluent in multiple languages, and meet strict physical standards, a maximum weight of 130 pounds and a minimum height of 5'2". The grooming regulations were law. Girdles were mandatory to ensure a perfectly smooth silhouette under their soldier blue skirts, and supervisors performed bottom pinch checks before every flight to ensure compliance. Their uniforms were custom-fitted, their hair could never touch their collars, and they were required to wear Revlon's Persian melon lipstick and nail polish, a rule dictated by the fact that the CEO of Revlon sat on Pan Am's board. It was a lifestyle of high-end hotels and envelopes of cash for expenses, but it was anchored by a culture that demanded they resign the moment they married or turned 32. In 1966, Trippe made the biggest gamble of his career. Facing congested skies, he asked Boeing's Bill Allen to build a plane 2.5 times larger than the 707. The agreement was a handshake. Trippe would buy it if Allen built it. Pan Am signed a $525 million contract for 25 Boeing 747s, an investment worth nearly $5 billion today. It was meant to be the final triumph, but the timing was a disaster. The 747 entered service in January 1970, just as the global economy hit a recession and the 1973 oil crisis sent fuel costs soaring by 400%. Suddenly, Pan Am was flying half-empty jumbo jets that cost millions to operate. The company began to hemorrhage cash, losing over $100 million in just 27 months. Trippe had retired in 1968, and the managers who followed him lacked his strategic genius. They found themselves trapped in a golden cage. Pan Am was a global powerhouse with no domestic routes to feed passengers into its international hubs. While competitors like United and TWA had vast networks within the U.S., Pan Am was forbidden by the government from flying domestic routes. The 1978 Airline Deregulation Act was the final death sentence. For decades, Pan Am had flourished in a protected, government-set price market. Now, the market was open, and nimbler, low-cost carriers began to undercut Pan Am's high union wages and bloated management layers. In a desperate attempt to gain a domestic network, Pan Am entered a catastrophic bidding war for National Airlines in 1980. They overpaid, spending $437 million for a carrier whose easygoing Southern culture clashed violently with Pan Am's high-pressure New York ethos. The merger was a textbook failure. Pan Am harmonized National's lower salaries with its own high union scales, turning National's profitable routes into immediate losers. To cover the growing debt, the board began a tragic process of asset stripping. In 1981, they sold their iconic Manhattan headquarters to MetLife for $400 million. In 1986, they sold the entire Pacific Division, the heart of Trippe's empire, to United for $750 million. In 1991, they sold the North Atlantic routes to Delta. The airline was eating itself to survive. During these desperate final years, a dark shadow emerged in the wings. In 1987, Stephen Jude Hoffenberg, the man behind one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history, hired a young consultant named Jeffrey Epstein. Together, using Towers Financial as a raiding vessel, they launched a hostile takeover attempt of Pan Am. They set up offices in Manhattan, and Hoffenberg paid Epstein $25,000 a month to orchestrate the raid. While the attempt ultimately failed, Hoffenberg later claimed that Epstein was the architect of the scam, using the chaos of the airline's decline to move assets through a web of shell companies. The raid was eventually derailed by the 1988 Lockerbie bombing, but the presence of these predators highlighted just how vulnerable the Blue Globe had become. On December 21, 1988, Flight 133, the clipper Maid of the Seas, was blown apart by a terrorist bomb over Scotland. All 259 people on board died. The tragedy was compounded by the Moscow Embassy Bulletin scandal. A warning from the FAA about a potential Christmas-time bombing had been posted on a public bulletin board at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow 2 weeks before the crash. Rumors swirled that government officials had seen the warning and changed their flights, leaving civilians in the crosshairs. While investigations found no evidence of diplomats switching bookings, the perception of a double standard destroyed the last of the public's trust in the airline. The end came with a whimper, not a bang. On December 4th, 1991, Delta Airlines withdrew its final funding commitment and Pan Am officially ceased operations. The final flight, PA 436 from Barbados to Miami, was a funeral in the sky. Captain Mark Pyle eased the nose of the Boeing 727 Clipper Goodwill skyward one last time as he flew over the volcanic islands of the Caribbean as his flight attendants wept in the galley. When they touched down in Miami, the aircraft was greeted by the arcing sprays of water cannons and thousands of employees who had gathered on the perimeter road to say goodbye to an era. The second most recognized logo in the world was grounded forever. Today, the Pan Am name survives as a fashion icon and a nostalgic memory for those who remember when flying was an adventure. In 2026, a new group called Aviate Air Capital is attempting to resurrect the brand as a scheduled commercial carrier based in Miami. They plan to fly modern Airbus A320neos, aiming to blend the legacy of prestige with 21st century efficiency. But whether a brand built on 1950s glamour can survive in a world of budget seating and digital boarding passes remains to be seen. The fall of Pan Am is a haunting lesson that even the most powerful empire can be undone by its own success, proving that when a giant refuses to adapt, the horizon it once conquered eventually becomes its graveyard. The blue globe may be gone from the skies, but its ghost still haunts every terminal in the world, reminding us of a time when the sky wasn't just a destination, it was the American dream.